Welcome to Lesson 3 of PSRM Fundamentals Overview, where we'll be discussing the taxpayer. We'll be introducing you to the main registration entities used in creating a taxpayer, and specifically here we'll be creating a manual business person, an account, and on top of that we will be adding a tax roll and obligation, as well as looking at different admin objects related to the taxpayer. And begin our story by creating within the application a new person. First thing to mention that when we say person doesn't necessarily mean an actual real individual person. It can also mean a business, and in fact we're going to be creating a business, and we'll be taking the person type, which we'll look at in a moment, person type being a business, and we'll be creating a business called store. We're going to call it store AAA, and you will see that even though, as I said, it's person, we can use it to describe a business as well. This is the primary way of naming a person, the store, so we're going to use the primary name. You can also have other types of ways of naming this particular store, but we're going to use the primary. We can use an ID, and we're going to use an employer ID, which we're going to just simply make one up. There is a format here which describes the format you need to be in. If you have phone numbers and addresses, basic information that you would need to create this business. If I want to create an address, I will create an address, start the address on today, and I can add a new address. I could add one in the US, and I'm just making a fictitious address. Just completely made up, and I'm going to save that. And it fills in my address for me. And if I want to actually be able to send letters to it, I need to say that it's preferred for correspondence, and it's deliverable, so I can send letters there. And I can just save this information. Actually mentions a warning that I have an ID already created, so therefore with the same ID, so I'm going to actually create a different one so it can be unique. And so if there's some issues like that, there are warnings that come up within the system. So I've created a new person, and as I create the new person, you will see that the screen refreshes, and on the right hand side on the current contacts, it now it shows me the new store AAA that I've created, and we see that this has been created with the new information. Now every single entity, like person, has a corresponding, normally admin entity. In this example we have a person type. If we click on business, it comes to a person type business, and it will show below the information. And most important information, first of all, shows you the type of address we could fill in, and we saw before that we could fill in an office, and that's because we allowed an address type of office. And also the most important thing here is that it shows the person business object. And this actually is important because it defines the actual particular fields which were on that person screen. And to show you that how this works and how it can change dependent upon the person BO, I'm going to actually create a different person now and show you that it can look a little bit different if I use a different person type with a different person BO. So if I actually chose let me now try an individual person, different person type, and here we see that the person name is actually different. It doesn't have just one field, it has multiple fields for first and last name, because this is actually used, this person type is used for a real individual person. So I'm just going to fill in a random name here, and I'm going to just give a, let's say, social security number. And that's all I'm going to fill in for now. And it comes up with another warning that I don't have an address, but I don't really mind not having an address. And what I'm going to do now is show you that we have a different look and feel here for the person name, and it has a person type individual because it's using the individual person type, which has a different BO. And that was my main point, to show that the business object is a very important concept used a lot to describe and use different types of fields within the application, and also defines life cycle differences as well. Anyway, the point is, if I actually now go back to my my person that I was on before, and I'm using the history here, I'm going to go back to my store. I can just edit that, and in this particular case, I'm going to use that particular Fred Smith that I created to add that to my business, because I'm going to add him as the financial officer of this particular company. And it's going to be the, let's say, the corporate officer. Okay, so I can add to this business a related person within the system. So we actually have a person of type business with a child person who happens to be an individual and is linked to this particular person. So you can have person-to-person relationships. So that is the first entity that we need to create in order to have a taxpayer. But the taxpayer is not just a person, it needs to have a lot more to that. And the next thing that we will need is an account. If I go to my current context, I can actually directly go to account and add in a plus and add an account. And I'm going to save this, first of all. And immediately I've saved it, you see we now jump in context, more information, and we see that we have now a balance, a zero balance, but we have a balance. Previously we didn't have a balance at all. And now we have two objects, a person and an account entity. And if we have a look, we will see that the account was automatically type was used was business, and that's because we had an underlying person who was also of a business type. Important information here includes the access group. This access group defines which particular users of the system will be able to access this account, and those users who have this access group will be able to look at store AAA. It happens to be that user 00 is of access group, has access to this group, so I will be able to look at this. Important information which were filled in automatically would have, was the person tab. Person tab here, you will see the underlying person, which happens to be the store associated with this account. Okay, and it's considered the primary taxpayer, financially responsible, and that is the link between the account and the person. Now, if I wanted to have direct debits, I could fill out information under my autopay. This is used for both for if I want to automatically have payments coming from my bank account, or let's say if the other way around, if I overpay and I want to have refunds directly sent as direct deposits, this information could be used. It's not the only place, it's not needed necessarily, but this is the information where you could possibly fill it in. Important other tab is collections, and as we know, if this account is in debt and we want to have a collection, we need a way of actually affecting and creating what we'll see later is an overdue process, and that is the most important thing here is the collection class. Business taxpayer defines what type of processes will run and will be used in order to create those collections and those overdue processes. And this was used both for overdue processes and even the other way around. Again, if your account is paid too much and you want overpayment processes to start, this is also dependent on the collection class. In fact, I'm going to just open up a second tab over here, and I'm going to be using two tabs a lot, but I'm going to use this as an opportunity to show you on the admin screen there's something called the collection class overdue rules, and these are the rules which will run, we'll be looking at them later. These are the rules which run and processes which will run to check to see whether there is the account on this particular, the balance on this account is in debt, and therefore we will want to create an overdue process. Or the other way around, we will also be checking for an overpayments. So this particular collection class, business taxpayer, is associated with this information over here, and again, it's related to the balance of the whole account, and will influence collections and also overpayments. There are other tabs like characteristics and alerts that we don't need to look at the moment. Compliance is a way of actually, if, for example, if a taxpayer doesn't pay on time, we can influence their compliance, their rating, and based upon their rating, they might actually get different overdue processes starting. There are other aspects which, all these things are trying to encourage the user to pay on time. And again, the compliance rating starts at 1,000. In this case, will go down if they don't pay on time. So this is the second entity. Account. Now, after the account, in order to create the taxpayer, you still don't have an association with a tax role. You don't have it related to a tax type yet. If I actually go to, before that, I just want to show you that we have this account has an account type called business. So we mentioned before, every entity also has an admin entity. So if I go to my account, you see now I can go to account type and find the business. And it defines, for example, the default collection class that we saw on the account. And there are other more technical configurations set here with different algorithms on the control setting. So that's the account and the account type. If I actually go now and go to my home and I look up my account, I look up the person that created the store, I can see in my 360-degree view that we introduced in the introduction chapter, we can see a tree info about the account, person, the address that I created. Nothing has been created for financial transactions yet. There's nothing called a tax roll yet. The current balance is 0, but that will change as we go through. Now, as we add more entities to this particular account. Now, the next thing that I would want to show you is the is the tax type. And the tax type that I would like to actually look at is I'm going to go to the tax type. At the moment, this account is not associated with a particular type of tax, and we're going to be using a sales and use tax. And you will see that there are many settings related to this particular tax type. Let me just describe a few of them. One of them defines whether we actually need to create something called obligations. Does the tax type, and we'll be creating what's called a tax roll in a minute, which is associated with this type, will it automatically create those obligations? Will we need to actually create a registration form? What type of calendar do we expect this particular type of tax type to use? In this particular case, we show that 3 calendars could be associated with the sales and use, but the default one is going to be the quarterly calendar. If we go to that calendar for a moment, we would go to something called the revenue calendar, and we will see the expected times for filing for this particular tax type. So we were in the sales and use quarterly, and you will see that for each particular year, let's say 2014, we have 4 periods, a beginning and ending period, and the expected filing date. And when you have a few extra grace days, or in this case we don't have any grace days, we're expected, for example, let's take this one, that if you file for the first quarter in 2014, you're expected to file by the 15th of April. And you will see later that if you don't file by the 15th of April, you might get other penalties and interest starting for not filing on time or not paying on time. But this particular filing due date is extremely important in determining penalties and interest that we'll look at later on. And again, these revenue calendar, going back in the history now, is associated with a tax type. So how do we link an account to a tax type? That's through something called a tax roll. So I'm going to go back now to the tab over here. And what I'm going to do is click on the context over here, and I'm going to go and add a tax roll. Then I'm going to take the sales and use. That's going to be the example we're going to use throughout the class, sales and use. And it brings me up a screen showing me when do I actually begin my relationship with the tax authority, and I'm going to, just for simplicity's sake, take the beginning of 2014. You can change the business name if there's a different business name for this particular store, and you could have different contact information. And you can imagine that you could have different tax rolls for the same business. You could have, let's say, a chain of stores which are basically operating in different parts of the country with different tax law and tax rates, and you might create multiple tax rolls for each one of them. So there might be different contact information for each particular one. There's an industry code if you want to actually define a particular industry for this particular store. Let's say retail trade, and related persons, managers, location managers, and so on, and addresses as well. As I said before, if you have a different chain of stores throughout the country, you might have different addresses for each particular tax roll, and you create a separate tax roll for each. But in this case, I'm going to create one and one only, one tax roll. I'm not going to fill in this information, it's not necessary, and I'm going to save it just to see what happens now. I didn't have an effective calendar because I changed the beginning date to the 2014, so I need to change my effective date to the beginning of 14. I'm going to use the default calendar, my expected to file 4 times in quarterly in each year. So I create my tax roll. And what you actually see, as well as creating the information that I filled in, that we've created what is called obligations. And that basically is that for each particular period of time for the calendar, I've created an obligation. So I've created an obligation for the first quarter, and for each one of these obligations, I have an expectation that I will actually create a tax form for each particular one. And the reason why that was set up automatically was because of what I mentioned before, that this particular tax roll is set with a tax type for maintaining obligations. So we actually have now 4 obligations created, each one for each particular period of time. So what do we see here? We've shown how the tax roll is associated with a tax type, and we now can see that for each particular period we have an obligation. So if we click on an obligation over here, this now represents the taxpayer's expected obligation to the authority for this specific period of the first quarter, and the expectation is that you are going to actually file on the particular filing period, on this particular, since it's going to be, if I click on here, the filing period over here, I expect to actually file for this particular period on the, we'll see, on the 14th of the due date, which we saw before. So now what we've done is we have created, just to summarize, we created the person, we created the account, we created a tax roll, and the tax roll itself created in the background 4 obligations. So we have 4 associated entities, and we don't have any assessments. We don't have any financial transactions associated with this particular taxpayer yet. But we've now set up everything that would be needed, that we could actually now add on assessments. Now, as I said, we have here the obligation. An obligation is associated always with an admin object, and this one is the obligation type. I can look at the obligation type. Just another opportunity to point out the difference in pages. This is again an older looking page where you could actually edit and update on the same page, as opposed to the taxpayer. This one is the newer one. In order to edit, I would need to click the edit button. In this particular case, therefore, so I can't directly go to the obligation type. I need to search on obligation type here. Just to show you what the obligation type looks like. There's lots of settings and configuration that you can use, and we will look at some of them as we go through. The one which I just want to point out at the moment is that we have something called P&I control, and this is really how the different penalties and interests are going to be created, are going to be dependent upon the settings I put in over here. So we'll look back at that soon. But it does have other things like those particular assessments, obligations, which adjustments are associated with it is associated through adjustment profile. There are also many more technical things like algorithms, many things that can be configured. But from the daily working, a user will not be looking at this information and will definitely not be changing it. So it's could be more interesting to look at in when one's interested in configuration, and there are other courses that cover that. But at the moment, we are really just looking at the main functionality, so I just wanted to show you that the obligation has the obligation type. We will be looking at other things here. We're coming back and look at something called the debt category priority later on, but I think that's enough for the moment. So, what have we looked at in this second lesson? What we have seen is that there are many different entities to create a taxpayer. First of all, there is the person, where we define either an individual person or a business, all can be defined underneath what is called the person entity, and we place in many demographic information, and in it itself doesn't necessarily even represent a taxpayer. There is no balance related to that person, and there is no expectation to pay anything. On top of the person, we added an account, and once you have an account, you can have a balance, and we saw that there are administration configuration around an account to do with collection class, related to the overdue process, and also for overpayment process, which we will look at later. When we created the person, we also created address entity. We created addresses. You can have multiple addresses as well. And once we added the account, on top of that, we added the tax roll. And once you have a tax roll, you now have a financial relationship between the taxpayer to the agency for a particular type of tax type and for a particular calendar. So you now know the expected time to file. That's what the filing calendar tells you, the expected time to file, and there are due dates on the, as we saw on the filing calendar, also known as a revenue calendar. We saw that since the tax type actually had that the tax roll maintains obligations automatically for each particular period on that filing calendar, a obligation was created. So we have the revenue calendar, which is associated with the tax roll, and then for each particular revenue period, an obligation was created. Again, at this moment, we haven't actually created any assessments or financial transactions, and we will be doing that in the next chapter when we look at forms. When we create a tax form, the tax form will add on those assessments and other financial transactions as well. This is a good opportunity just to highlight what we have already mentioned, that for each one of the entities that we introduced here, there's always, or nearly always, an admin object related to that. So for example, the person has something called the person type, and it defined, for example, which fields are on that person entity. We saw there's a difference between the individual person, which has a first name, last name, and the business one that only has one field. And then for an account, there is something called the account type, and it defines the default monitoring rules. And there's also the addresses. The address actually doesn't have an address type for this example. So not all of them actually do have one. The tax roll we saw has a tax type, and it defined the possible calendars and other rules for determining how the tax roll controls other things like obligation. So the tax type works together with the tax roll. And then we saw the obligation, which was created, has an obligation type, and it has many rules like the P&I rules, penalty and interest rules. So this is a general thing, and we'll see a feature throughout the whole of these classes, that for all the different functionality that we generally have the transactional objects, that we call them, like the person account, and then we have the configuration, the admin object,